So have you ever taken one of those genetic tests? You know, I'm talking about like the 23andMe. Was it worth it? I've been looking at them while researching this episode and I don't know, man, $169 plus you have to pay a membership fee? Listen, like, I get it, okay? I don't have a dad. I don't know what's happening in half of what's going on in me, but like, maybe some things are better left a mystery, you know what I mean? I don't know. Let me know in the comments below if you've ever gotten one of these done. I would love to know. Today we're talking all about investigative genealogy, which means using third-party DNA to fight crime, okay? How was it used in this Idaho murder investigation? And then all the weird legal and ethical issues with it that you might have never thought about. Let's do it. Before we dive into that, let me take a moment to thank the sponsor of today's video, Factor. When I am busy delving into my research, bringing you these high-quality videos, the last thing that I want to do is cook. Okay, listen, I know some people, you don't like New Year's resolutions, but I love them. Okay, new year, new me, fresh start, you know, and this year I'm continuing to focus on my health. If you've been following me on my other social media channels, you know that I've been learning more about hormones and my body and using diet and nutrition to help improve how I feel day to day. Factor makes meeting your nutrition goals easier than ever by delivering fresh, never frozen, dietitian approved meals right to your doorstep. And there's a reason that I keep working with Factor. I genuinely love their food. It's so easy. There is nothing to prepare. You just pop it in the microwave and then boop, 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 it's done. And it's genuinely tasty as hell. I love that there's no prep, there's no mess to clean up after with Factor meals, because y'all, I'm busy and I'm not particularly passionate about cooking, okay? Factor meals arrive pre-prepared and ready to eat in 2 minutes. So I get to eat food that I know is fresh and healthy, but Factor also offers a really great variety with a rotating weekly menu of 25 plus meal options. I loved this sun-dried tomato chicken with zucchini noodles that I tried recently. It was delicious. And I didn't have to cook it. I cannot stress to you how much I love Factor. Factor has become my go-to lunch or dinner solution when I'm juggling a million things throughout my day and I don't have time to cook. They also have these delicious protein-rich smoothies that are so handy when I need to head out the door, but I don't know if I'll have time to refuel before I get home. And they have a variety of meal plans to choose from, including keto, vegan, vegetarian, protein plus, meals on a rotating menu each week. Factor is now owned by HelloFresh, so with both brands I really enjoy the flexibility of being able to cook conveniently with HelloFresh or grab and go with Factor. Love this for me! Head to go.factor75.com/Leeja60 to get 60% off your first Factor box. Have you been following the Idaho murders of these 4 college students at the University of Idaho? I think I have an entire separate video's worth of opinions around our obsession with true crime and like internet sleuths and stuff. I think I'll probably make an entire separate video on that. Comment below if you want to see that, I guess. So I'm not making this video to get into the gory detail about the actual crime. Again, this is not a true crime channel if you're confused, but I do want to give some detail for context. And the detail itself, yeah, it's gory. I was researching this last night. I had to stop researching because I got a little spooked. Things were starting to go bump in the night. I was making up sounds in my head. I was getting a little freaked out, okay? Not for the faint of heart. So if you don't know, here's what happened. Around 4 a.m. on the morning of November 13th, 4 college students in a 6-bedroom house located in Moscow, Idaho, which is a college town on the border with Washington state. They were sleeping in 2 different bedrooms. 𝗫𝗓 𝗪𝗏 and Ethan Chapin were dating, and they were in one bed together in a bedroom on the 2nd floor. And Madison Mogen and Kaylee 𝗕𝗠𝗔𝗓𝗓 were longtime, lifelong best friends, and they were in a bedroom on the 3rd floor. It was around 4 a.m. A man, at least 5'10", with bushy eyebrows, wearing a ski mask that covered his nose and mouth, entered the house and stabbed the 4 college students to death in their beds. As he was exiting the final bedroom, another roommate, because there was 6 of them, not just the 4, another roommate opened her door, came face to face with him in the dark. And as she stood there in shock, he walked right by her, out of the house, got in his white Hyundai Elantra, and sped off into the night. For the next month and a half, the city of Moscow was on high alert. Accusations were flying wildly as to who the suspect would be. Some people were saying it was the roommates who survived. Some were saying it was a random ex-boyfriend. Some were saying it was the guy who dropped the DoorDash off that morning. Some were saying that it was the guy at the food truck that they got food from. Like, there was so many accusations flying because no one actually knew. And this was happening again for a month and a half until December 29th. A warrant was issued for the arrest of Bryan Kohberger, a Washington State University criminology student, on 1 count of burglary and 4 counts of first-degree murder. In order to get a warrant to arrest someone, in case you didn't know, the cops have to show probable cause to believe that the person committed the crime. Probable cause is typically shown, in many cases, through an affidavit, which is a sworn statement made often by a police officer with knowledge of the investigation. That affidavit has now been released, which gives us some insight into how the investigation unfolded. And here are some key details, okay? A knife sheath, you know, like the holder of the blade, was found on the ground next to one of the beds. Male DNA evidence was lifted from that sheath. A white Hyundai Elantra was seen driving back and forth 4 times on nearby surveillance footage on a quiet side street right in front of the house at 4 a.m. Suspicious. The police hunted down every white Hyundai Elantra in the area, and they found Bryan Kohberger's at WSU, Washington State University, and saw that he fit the description of the suspect. He was 6 feet tall, he's got bushy eyebrows, I guess. When I think bushy eyebrows, I think like Groucho Marx bushy, but I guess you could call those bushy, approximately 180 pounds. He fit the description. Using this lead, they got a hold of Kohberger's cell phone records and saw that he had gone near the scene of the crime at least 12 times leading up to the actual murders, and that the night of the murders, the cell phone records show him leaving his home in Washington, heading in the direction of Moscow. Then the cell phone signal disappears at around 2:47 a.m., which usually happens if someone's shut the phone off or put it on airplane mode. And it doesn't come back online again until 4:48 a.m. And when it does come back online, it shows him traveling away from Moscow back towards his home. After this, the cops then confiscated trash from Bryan Kohberger's parents' home in Pennsylvania. So this is like a multi-state cross-border investigation at this point. The FBI get involved when things like that happen. And that trash from Bryan Kohberger's parents' home was then sent to a lab in Idaho for testing, and they compared the DNA retrieved at the parents' home to the DNA found on the knife sheath using genetic genealogy, and they found that the DNA collected at his parents' house likely belonged to the biological father of the person whose DNA was left on the knife sheath. I cannot say knife sheath. Can't say that fast. So you have the Hyundai Elantra, the knife sheath, the cell phone data, and the DNA match all pointing to this guy being the killer. Which, sorry, okay, first of all, if you're a student of criminology, like he was getting a PhD in it, and he was clearly very interested in the psychology of killers because it came out that at one point someone under the name Bryan Kohberger posted on Reddit asking people who were incarcerated or formerly incarcerated to tell him specifically the psychology of like how they were thinking and feeling during the commission of a crime. Like this guy was in it deep. He was studying criminals, okay? If you're doing this, if you're spending all this time studying this, wouldn't you be like a little more careful? Wouldn't you know the patterns of killers and not do the same thing, like casing the house 12 times before the crime, showing up over and over at the same place with your cell phone turned on, driving back and forth by the house right before the murder at 4 a.m. when it's a quiet street, leaving evidence and DNA at the scene of the crime? I don't know. This all seems like murder 101. If you ask me. Anyway, so that's what the affidavit says, but what it doesn't say is just as interesting. According to some reports, this has not been verified, this is just something I found in my research, there is a very important missing link according to these reports in this story. When the cops were searching for that white Elantra, at one point they had a list of 22,000 cars in the area, because the Hyundai Elantra is one of the most popular sedans on the market, and white is one of the most popular car colors. And Kohberger did not initially stand out to them as an out-of-the-ordinary person on that list. In fact, there was an initial search of phone pings from the tower near the scene of the crime on the night in question, and it didn't turn up his phone number. Because again, it mysteriously went offline during the night of the murder. But the cops didn't know this at that point, so he didn't stand out to them from this list because he wasn't anywhere near the scene of the crime when it was happening, according to that cell phone ping. He was just one name on a list of 22,000 other names. And some are saying that the missing link that the cops needed to pick Kohberger out of the bunch was found using forensic genealogy, or more specifically, investigative genetic genealogy. Now, what is investigative genetic genealogy? Well, I'm glad you asked. Now listen, you've probably heard about this before because it was famously used to nab the Golden State Killer back in 2018, but let's just break it down quick, okay? So there are databases of DNA information on the interwebs, the World Wide Web. Genealogists can take DNA material gathered from a crime scene, run a test on it similar to the test done by those online databases like 23andMe, and then upload the test results to a database and find family members who had already uploaded their DNA results to the website, build out a family tree from that, and from there, locate the killer. This technique is pretty new. It wasn't until 2018 that it gained national prominence by helping to identify, like I said, the Golden State Killer. And since then, it's been used to help solve hundreds of cases, some of them cold for decades, as well as to exonerate the wrongly accused. So in the case of the Golden State Killer, investigators uploaded a DNA test done with the killer's decades-old DNA into a database, identified third cousins based on that DNA, and then painstakingly created a family tree by connecting relatives across branches of distant ancestors, and by cross-referencing shared bits of DNA with public records, obituaries, and social media profiles. In criminal cases, law enforcement may also contact family members for information or additional DNA to narrow down the possible hits. And once potential suspects have been identified, they are then further narrowed down based on the physical features described by eyewitnesses. So that's what it is. That's how law enforcement uses it to solve cases, but it's not that simple, it turns out, because nothing ever is. And there's a whole host of potential issues that present themselves when the cops are able to access our DNA. First of all, I do want to get one thing straight, and it's something that I didn't know and I think is a common misconception. Private companies like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, MyHeritage, they do not allow the cops to openly use their services. The only way cops can obtain personal information from users on those websites is through a warrant or a subpoena or some court order. According to 23andMe on its website, it says 23andMe chooses to use all practical, legal, and administrative resources to resist requests from law enforcement, and we do not share customer data with any public databases or with entities that may increase the risk of law enforcement access. In certain circumstances, however, 23andMe may be required by law to comply with a valid court order, subpoena, or search warrant for genetic or personal information. Now, to get a subpoena for personal information, the cops would need to have probable cause, which is hard to get when you're just using crime scene DNA and like throwing spaghetti on the wall to figure out if they can find a match amongst thousands of other matches. They would need a specific person and probable cause in order to request personal info from 23andMe, and by the time a specific person has been named, well, that defeats the purpose of going to a private company like that anyway, because they've already identified people. So cops accessing private databases like 23andMe is very rare. Instead, the cops are accessing public databases to do this work. One database that all cops have access to is called 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗧, which is a repository of all DNA collected from people by like the FBI, but that's pretty limited and it doesn't have as many genetic markers in it as these other private companies do, nor does it have the ability to make the connections and build family trees. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about two public databases specifically called JuddMatch and Family Tree DNA. These databases do not offer DNA tests themselves. Instead, members can upload their results from the tests that they obtained from companies like 23andMe to find more results. It's basically a conglomeration of all the people who input their DNA results, allowing for more potential family tree connections. And those are public databases. I mean, you have to sign up for it, but you get what I mean. However, people who upload have to give permission for their DNA to be used by law enforcement, and the sites restrict law enforcement's use to only murder, sexual assault, violent crimes. However, when you upload to those sites, you are automatically opted in to allow law enforcement to access your DNA, and you must take an additional step to opt out. And some reports say that uploads to these sites have actually increased since the Golden State Killer case, indicating that people may want to provide their info for law enforcement. In fact, the website touts itself as having helped solve hundreds of crimes. And that makes sense. I mean, they're solving cold cases, they're helping fight for justice. It makes sense why people would feel compelled to upload their DNA results. However, there are some ethical and legal dilemmas with this, and in recent years, lawmakers have begun to restrict the access that law enforcement has to DNA results. And the entire genealogy community is divided over this issue. One reason why there's so much controversy is because, of course, the cops have abused this technology in the past. Apparently, at one point, JuddMatch allowed police to upload DNA from the scene of a physical assault, but that's against its own terms of service, because its own terms of service restrict law enforcement to use only cases of homicide or sexual assault, which then begs the question, if you're willing to break your own terms of service in favor of a cop once, like, where's the line, okay? How will people know what they're actually agreeing to? And people who upload their DNA may not know that the DNA that they're offering is being used to arrest their relatives. And this, of course, has also been abused by the police. For example, in 2018, police in Orlando, Florida asked a woman for a DNA test, telling her that they believed she was related to a dead person that they were trying to identify. She complied, only to find out that they were actually investigating her son, who was subsequently arrested and charged with murder. And then there's the issue that privacy policies and terms of service are just written words on a website, and law enforcement can easily, surreptitiously create profiles on any site and use it without alerting the site to the fact that they're law enforcement. This is, again, against the terms of service, but they could do it, and of course, if this happened, the defendant would be able to argue in court that the ancestry DNA evidence was illegally obtained and therefore can't be used in court, but that would require the defendant to know that it was illegally obtained to begin with, and it's unclear whether that would be uncovered. There's also the issue that law enforcement can obtain DNA evidence from third parties by taking trash from outside their homes and testing it for DNA without their consent. This was written into law before publicly available DNA testing and results were at the level that they're at now. And back when this became law, the DNA that was found would usually be used to compare to a suspect, not uploaded into a database to find an entire family tree, not to mention the huge number of markers revealed in these newer DNA tests. It'd be like law enforcement getting access to your health records just to identify you. Okay, back to Brian Kohberger. Some reports are saying that while the affidavit does lay out how law enforcement took a piece of trash from Kohberger's parents' home and used it to match the crime scene DNA, with the trash as being a 99.9% match to the father of the killer, which is technically a form of investigative genealogy, some reports are saying that the reason why Kohberger became a prime suspect at all was because they took the DNA found at the crime scene and uploaded it and built a family tree. And now that's not laid out in the affidavit at all. However, I will say typically these affidavits provide only enough information to make a case for an arrest. It doesn't contain every single detail of the investigation. Could it be that they left this critical piece out because of the legal murkiness of using DNA to find criminals, and the rest of the evidence against him is so compelling that they didn't really need to explain how they got there? I don't know. Now, there is the explanation that it just wasn't used at all. But at least one article I found, which claimed inside information over at Slate, says that it is very possible that genealogy was used, and leaving it out of the affidavit has people divided. Some saying it's fine, it's no big deal. They often leave out how they arrived at their conclusions, like they don't mention anonymous tips or internet searches a lot of the times in these affidavits, and since the actual use of genetic genealogy to initially pinpoint him out of the list of Elantra owners, if it was used, isn't direct evidence of his guilt, so it likely wouldn't even be presented to jurors. It's again a piece of the puzzle, but it's not necessary. In another camp, people want transparency because members of the public have opted in to sharing their DNA profiles, and they deserve to know how those DNA profiles were used. Plus, usually when investigators use CODIS, the government database, they tend to mention that in an affidavit. So some argue that getting a partial hit, like a third cousin in a DNA database search, should also be included. And some lawmakers agree that the use of investigative genealogy should be more transparent. In 2021, Maryland and Montana became the first states in the nation to restrict law enforcement's use of genetic genealogy. Now in Maryland, investigators need to get a judge's sign-off before using the method, and it must only be used for serious crimes. And yes, JuddMatch and Family Tree DNA already had that it can only be used for serious crimes in their terms of service, but prior to these new laws, there was literally no guidance on how law enforcement could use this technology, so the industry was just self-regulating. With the laws in place, that means that there would be consequences if these databases violate their own terms of service moving forward, which they've done in the past, okay? The Maryland law was sponsored by a Democrat. The law in Montana, which requires investigators to obtain a search warrant before using a DNA database, was sponsored by a Republican, which indicates that this issue is not easily divided along partisan lines. And the reason for these laws has a lot to do with privacy and what's protected under the Constitution. That's right, the Founding Fathers foresaw the rise of genetic genealogy, and they protected it. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. We're talking about the Fourth Amendment protections against searches and seizures, but it's a fun example of the way the Constitution has been molded and shaped and interpreted over the years to fit new technology and new realities that the writers of the Constitution could have never foreseen. It's almost like the Constitution is a living, adaptable document that probably shouldn't be taken as the word of God and only interpreted based on the reality the writers were living in the 1700s. Weird. Anyway, the Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, and many have argued that use of someone's DNA data by law enforcement without their consent constitutes an unreasonable search, because the amount of data that it gives them access to is pretty vast. But just like the Fourth Amendment, these new laws do allow for those searches to take place under certain circumstances, like when the owner of the DNA gave their consent. Though this law does require that if police officers want to test the DNA of third parties, they must get written consent unless a judge approves the deceptive collection. So like when they went to Kohberger's parents' house and got his dad's trash and the DNA off of it, they would have needed to have obtained a warrant first before collecting that DNA. Honestly, at that point, the cops probably had enough evidence to find probable cause to collect the DNA and then test it. In fact, they probably had enough probable cause to just arrest him outright without doing that DNA testing. They probably would have still been able to get a warrant, but I'm sure there have been many times when that's not the case. And there are many, however, notable critics of these laws. Probably most notable is Paul Holes, a cold case investigator who was on the team that found the Golden State Killer, and he is worried that these limitations to genetic genealogy could have dire consequences, especially for solving cold cases, especially where the DNA is old and fragile, and delay in testing or requirements like in Maryland where the DNA has to first be tested and then entered into CODIS, the government database. Holes is worried that that could degrade the DNA from repeat testing. So that's kind of where the sides stand. What do you think? I think one thing I didn't read in my research was any distinction in these laws or in these criticisms between ongoing investigations and cold cases, which I think cold cases warrant a little bit more leeway because it's not part of an ongoing investigation. You assume everything has been tried at that point, so it's more of a last resort in a cold case as opposed to a ongoing investigation where other methods might be available. But even with ongoing investigations, I think consent is key here, and I think the databases know that. Like I said, I've never done a DNA test, but I decided to make an account on JuddMatch to see how clear it is that you're agreeing to share info with law enforcement when you first sign up. And honestly, it's one of the more obvious terms of services that I've come across online. Typically, it's either like a link at the bottom of the page, or you check a box that says you've read them, but you're not required to actually like scroll through them and read, nor are you given explicit options. On JuddMatch, after I created a profile, it took me directly to this terms of service page, and it's long as hell, but it does clearly lay out the opt-in and opt-out procedure as part of the privacy options. After you sign the terms, you can then access the site, and when you upload your DNA data, you select the level of privacy you want. If you select private, that means that you get 0 results or connections. So like, I don't know who would pick that. If you pick opt-in, it gives law enforcement permission to find you if they are trying to identify human remains or if they're trying to identify perpetrators of violent crimes. If you opt out, that means that law enforcement cannot use your DNA to identify perpetrators of violent crimes, but it can still use your DNA to identify the remains of bodies. So either way, when you agree to use the site, you're kind of opting in both ways. And then at the bottom of these terms, you have the option to either agree to all the terms or reject all the terms and then get booted for the system, or you have an option to think about it, which I thought was an interesting idea. Like, I don't have time to read these right now, so let me decide later. It's a little more flexible than your typical terms of service, that you can't access anything until you decide. But I thought that was a nice third option. So what do you think? Would you opt in? Have you opted in? I'm fascinated to hear. Comment down below. Let me know if I should get signed up on this 23andMe. I am really on the fence about how I feel on this. Obviously, I kind of was vacillating back and forth. I think it's important to have these resources, especially for cold cases, for cases that have gone years with no solution, especially for exonerating innocent folks. I mean, I don't trust our criminal justice system very much, and so having another source of checks and balances on the criminal justice system, I think is a good thing. At the same time, I don't trust the cops, and I don't really want them to have access, though I did read that the amount of actual DNA information that they have access to is limited. Like, they're not given just your entire I don't know, genome or whatever the fuck it's called. So they don't have access to everything, but just given the fact that in the few short years that this technology has been available, the cops have already abused it multiple times, at least that we know of, it gives me pause. It gives me pause. But according to companies like 23andMe and other private companies, when you upload, they're not gonna share it with law enforcement unless law enforcement has a court order, which would only happen if like you yourself are accused of a crime or someone that they've identified immediately near you. So that would be rare. So maybe 23andMe is fine, but maybe I wouldn't upload it personally to the public databases. But then again, I want to help solve crime. I don't know, man. What do you think? I'm torn. Thanks again to my partner on today's video, Factor. Head to factor75.com/Leeja60 to get 60% off your first Factor box today. And if you enjoyed this and want to support my work, bringing you videos like this, please consider becoming a member of this channel or joining me over on Patreon, where we have a lively Discord chat, behind the scenes stuff, and so much more. Thank you especially to newest Patreon supporter, 𝗦𝗨𝗣𝗥𝗧𝗏. And as always, thank you to my royal patrons, Old Man Pence, Fork McSpoon, Ellen L, Leeja, and May Danger. And a very special thank you to my multi-platinum patrons, 𝗦𝗦𝗏𝗏𝗏, and 𝗓𝗏𝗓𝗏𝗏. Your generosity is greatly appreciated, and it makes this channel what it is, so thank you! And if you like this video, you might also like this recent video I made all about the 𝗦𝗨𝗣𝗏𝗧𝗦 trial. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye!